Excuse me. Do you have a program now? Do you know what
I'm not sure.
Oh, he's the president of the Liberation.
Good evening. I'd like just to say a few introductory words about how tonight's subject was born. We're honoring tonight, commemorating 10 years since the passing away of Professor Daniel Elazar, the founder of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and many other great academic projects and books. When I was thinking about what Don would be interested in at this point in time, he was always a person who looked at the big picture, not just at the minutia of our situation. And therefore, as a kind of big picture idea that ties us back to the Middle East, I was thinking about the following idea. There's a word I despise, which I'm going to have to use tonight. It's called the word narrative. The reason I despise the word narrative generally is because a narrative suggests there's no objective truth. The Israelis, the Jews say there was a temple. The other people say there was no temple. Depends on your narrative. There's never a truth. But it is a useful word because beyond our conflict with our immediate Palestinian and Arab state neighbors, there is a much larger struggle, if you look at the big picture, over the narrative in the Middle East. And unfortunately, we have conflicting narratives, not just with the Palestinian Arabs, but in general with the larger Muslim world. And that makes it very hard for us to sketch out beginnings of some kind of coexistence for the future. And one thought I had, and this is why I turned to Professor Ben-Sasson, was let us look back to the medieval period where you are one of the world's leading experts and see whether there were any nuggets of coexistence that we can build on. That when you meet somebody from Malaysia, you know what, from Saudi Arabia, and you can say, this happened and this is how we live together. You can help chart just the beginnings of some kind of common understanding of how we have to build our future by looking back on the past in a similar way. Let me be very clear. I am not suggesting tonight that we look back romantically to the jizya, the poll tax that the dhimmi had to pay in the period of Islamic rule, or the kharaj, the land tax. I'm trying to look for the positive elements. Maybe there are too few, and maybe there are more than we think. What about the intellectual interactions between Jewish philosophers and Muslim philosophers in the medieval period? These are the kind of questions I'm certainly curious about, and I know Professor Ben-Sasson is probably more than anybody else able to address. So let's try and get out of the usual minutia that we see every day and try and look at the big picture, which I think Dan would have wanted us to do. And therefore, before we get started, let me first ask Nomi Yakir, Dan's daughter, to say a few words on behalf of the family, and then we'll go on to the lecture. Nomi.
Good evening. I wanted to thank you all for coming here tonight in honor of my father's memory. It's hard to believe that 10 years have passed since my father passed away, and I remember his farewell as if it was yesterday. This evening I'd like to address my father's ability to place mind over matter in his daily activities, especially during the period in which he suffered from the effect of post-polio syndrome. Having to deal again with an illness he thought belonged to the past was discouraging, even overwhelming at times. The late effects of polio required from him to move from one state of mind to the other, and as you all know, my father was a blend of Jewish tradition and American culture with roots in both the land of Israel and the American interior Northwest. He was born a Zionist and remained one, ultimately settling in Israel, both to go back to his family's roots and to be part of what he stated as the most significant Jewish political opportunity of the last 2,000 years, the rebuilding of the Jewish state. Aside from being a great scholar, I believe that his experience as a person with disabilities increased his uncanny ability to touch, provoke, and evoke a deep human response. I truly believe that his pragmatism, which he no doubt learned from his father, was equally influenced by his disability. I believe that this led an additional discovery, namely that one cannot escape oneself, and as such, one must take responsibility for the course of one's life. This discovery confronted him with the following questions, forming the basis for much of his life research. What does it mean to make a difference in the life of others and in the world around us? How do those who make a difference come to have that capacity? Where do character and courage and vision come from, and what can be done to nurture them? At the age of 6, his parents took him on a trip to the Northern Plains and the Northern Rocky Mountains, what he described as love at first sight and one of the most decisive experiences of his life. That trip and other travels sharpened his sense of regional differences, which led to the development of the theory of American political culture and his interest in federalism, remaining the focal point of his work, and which expanded to include comparative studies and applications of federal principles and practices globally, including the Middle East. The essence of federalism is to allow different elements to coexist under a larger political framework. Thus, federalism is viewed as much more of a process and an approach, emphasizing that federal principles pertain to a set of relationships within a society, even more than the specifics of political arrangements. In his book, Federalism and the Way to Peace, he writes about improving intergroup relations, stating that while federalism is normally understood as having to do with political structures, in fact, the federal idea speaks principally to the character of human relationships. The covenant perspective that my father wrote so extensively about calls forth the virtues and the vision that makes governance more than mere management in the sense of being entrusted with the care of the community. The spirit that characterizes covenantal relationships really means the obligation of a partner to go beyond the narrowly construed contractual demands of the partnership. The collective social purpose of the covenant between God and humanity has always been the spiritual advancement of civilization, and as my father said, one of the greatest achievements of covenantal societies is the institutionalism of reform. That is the dedication on principle of political institutions to the improvement of social and economic conditions of all citizens. The basis of covenantal polity, not in common descent but in common consent, creates kinships of greater dignity and sanctity. Covenants are therefore more than instruments that bind, but are in fact liberating devices that call into existence new entities that create relationships and forge bonds of mutuality between different and formerly hostile people. It is a concept that has the potential to unite people in a global and moral order. It is this concept which has the potential to integrate the necessary aspects of unity and diversity, equality and equity, rights and responsibilities, freedom and limits, individual and community. My father was able to translate reality into patterns and patterns into moral principles that formed a theoretical framework to guide his various fields of research. He was a person with a mission that had the ability to clearly visualize both destinations and pathways, setting goals and attaining them. Meaningful social change in his mind was not simply a result of acquiring technical skills. More important is the development of qualities and attitudes that foster cooperative and creative patterns of human interaction. Both my brothers, who unfortunately could not attend this event, and I have directed our energy in a way that continues my father's approach to social change. One of the goals of my brother Gidon, who is currently in China researching the effect of Christianity on minority population, is to bring a religious perspective into academia, much like my father's endeavor to inform the field of political science in light of the Jewish political tradition. My other brother Tani is now working for the District Planning Committee of the Ministry of Interior, examining urban planning for various neighborhoods in Jerusalem, very closely related to my father's research and activity in the field of urban revitalization. He has also found a creative way of maintaining the Elazar Sephardi tradition by establishing a Sephardi egalitarian community here in Jerusalem, continuing my father's effort at reconstructing and revitalizing Sephardi Judaism. In the course of the past 10 years, and as part of an ongoing dialogue that I have managed to maintain with my father, I have learned how thoughts lead to destiny. I have searched for a way to translate this discovery, guided by my father's spirit, into a daily practice. Just 10 days before my father passed away, he asked me if I would be willing to take upon myself a role in his center, expressing to me his belief that if you only do what you know you can do, you never do much. Don't be afraid to challenge yourself, for if you believe in something, I know you will make it happen. When you know what you truly want, everything is secondary. The most I could promise him at the time was to take care of his vast collection of books, which I did over a course of 2 years with the help of my brother Gidon. We created a library in his memory at the center with the generous donation of Bill Berman. With tears in his eyes, during his last Shabbat on this earth, he expressed his hope to be remembered for the values that guided him in every action of his life, and which he tried to pass on to his children and grandchildren. People might forget what you have said, people might forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel, and that is so true for me. And it is with that in mind that I have directed my energy into developing a service that will allow other people less fortunate than me to experience this as well. Just as I have learned from your research and activity, so I hope to pass on a service that I have developed in my own center, Nativ, striving to teach people what I have learned from you. If we can watch our thoughts before they become words, if we can watch our words before they become actions, if we can watch our actions before they become habits, if we can watch our habits before they become character, if we can watch our character before it becomes our destiny. And so, Abba, we will not only remember you as we are doing this evening, we will continue to act. It demands from every one of us to sacrifice and give. When one discovers an ability to stop the pain of others, the challenge becomes irresistible. My father instilled in me, as I hope he did in you, the belief that one person does make a difference and that one's person in action makes a difference too. There are those that spend their time waiting for the perfect opportunity, and there are those who create those opportunities, and he was definitely one of them. And although the best time to plant a tree is always 20 years ago, the second best time is now. So I wanted to thank you again for coming here this evening and honoring
Professor Menachem Ben-Sasson is the president of Hebrew University, and looking over his CV, can't think of anybody more appropriate to speak on the evening where we're remembering Daniel Elazar. First of all, lots of books and lots of articles, and books actually that focus considerably on Jewish life in the Middle East and particularly North Africa. But someone who has written on Sadi Gaon, extensively on the Rambam, and therefore if we were trying to understand these interactions which I spoke about in the very beginning, I can't think of anybody more appropriate to try and help us go back to the past so maybe we can think about the future. Professor Ben-Sasson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shakir. It will be difficult to go on the path that you've just paved. Not only the words, but also the analysis and the thorough look into the work of your late father. You're lucky. to spare a few words about it. I would argue about one sentence that he told you, or he said to you. I think that his literary legacy and his daily work not only influenced me in person, in a second I'm going to confess, but also many others. Those who sit here, those who read, those who were capable of following his rich activity, his daring way, his outstanding analysis and look over things that people haven't dreamt of putting together into one pot and to make the cook, that at the end made it relevant to the days, to our days. So you are lucky that you have such a legacy, and you are lucky that you are working on such a library. And I'll refer later, maybe if you have some time, about community of a book that has to do with your father's legacy. But for the time being, my personal confession is that when I went to look for a topic for a PhD, I knew that I want to work about the relations between East and West and between the centers of Jewish world and the rising of the local Jewish community. But I needed terms or concepts, because the documents are there in the secondary surface, we share with you. But there is a need to see or to look for somebody who did it already, and who did it with a complete, or at least an integrative way, or concepts that can refer to the data that you can collect together and to make it meaningful. So I read many of his works about the public, about communities, about frames and ways, and the way people first expressed themselves and then made it into institutions, and to constitute it into constitutions that made it to the basic life of their communities of nowadays. And it was refreshing and it was promising, so I dared jumping, but I mean, jumping after somebody who did the work with you is not a real trick. I was safe all around, hopefully. The source material that I'm going to refer is, as many of you know, is the Cairo Geniza. So in that case, there is no narrative. There are facts. You cannot argue about 500,000 documents, literary pieces, responsa, poetry, philosophy, all coming haphazardly from few places in Cairo discovered at the second part of the 19th century and brought to the West through a series of activities, starting in Russia by a collector by the name of Avram Firkovich, a Karaite Jew, who took the nice part of it in the 1960s, and then came after a few other collectors, starting with Solomon Schechter, whose name is known to everybody here, and later on Jacques Mousseri, Adolf Neubauer. The terms who was the first is irrelevant. The term what comes out of it is what is really of our interest, and I'd like to do, even superficially, to draw a picture that refers to variety parts of life, in order to ask the questions that Dore said, and has to do with the topic of this evening. What comes out of the Cairo Geniza? Let's take it very superficially. First, the texts. The majority of the relevant texts are written in Hebrew characters, and that is the reason that they were kept as holy texts. However, when it comes to languages, you've got the Judeo-Persian, you've got some Judeo-German, which is the very beginning of Yiddish texts. You've got them a substantial amount, few hundreds, of Judeo-Spanish, Tardino, with its versions, but the vast majority of the texts going from the 9th century, the very beginning is 823, till the demise of the first and second generation of Maimonidean dynasty, are written in Judeo-Arabic, which is Arabic written in Hebrew characters. Not phonetic. At the beginning it had to do with phonetics, and in the very beginning of text are reflections of what people heard and they put on a page. So these are translations of Bible, translations of few halachic works, halachot Sukkot. All the beginnings are written either on parchment or on papyri. And interestingly enough, these are reflections of what people heard put on a page, and not necessarily with a consistent, canonized method of writing down what are the parables or the parallels of A or H or Het or Ein or Dad, all of these letters pronounced perfectly in Arabic, but not necessarily translated or transliterated into the Hebrew. And there was a revolution that took place at the 10th century consciously, deliberately. And it was done by one of the greatest scholars, whose name was mentioned already by Dore, of Jewish life. I mean, if you have to put 5 in the Jewish pantheon, I put him among the 5. His name was Saadia Gaon, Saadia ben Yosef Fayumi, born in 882, died in 942, and his life was dedicated to the rewriting of the Jewish content, to update the Jewish life into modernity of the 10th century. Why did I say deliberately? Because in his first book, written maybe, around 920 or 920s, around 920, he was less than 20 years old, he wrote the following. I write this book, it was sort of a dictionary for poets, giving them the beginning of lines of poets and the rhyming system and the method of changing between the words and making words out of a biblical word in a biblical method. The book's name is the Book of Egon, the Sefer Egon. Saadia wrote the following. I write this book because it is of a great need of this nation. And I saw among the Muslims people who wrote these books or books of this type. And I know the value and I know how useful such a book is. Therefore, I put aside some time, I dedicate my time to write this book as the first book written on this type among us, Jews, and I hope that people will follow later. And people follow later. If you go to Yehuda Levi's Kuzari, one of his sections is dedicated to poetry or to the rules of poetry. Saadia's idea is the first time that he wrote out of feeling of adoration, admiration, and he wanted to follow up what took place among the Muslims. You may say that it is not surely Muslim creativity. They followed the Greek ones. That was then translated to Arabic. But the role model was Muslim. And what Saadia did in this book, and now we'll follow to other types of creativity, that he translated or he imported the method, wrote it, and referred to another layer of Hebrew that people stopped using for hundreds of years. He went back to the biblical Hebrew. Why again? He said, since Arabs claim that their language is the language of God, and they claim that the language of the Quran could not be followed because it is the original word of God, therefore, says Saadia, I would like you to see that we've got a language, clear, fluent, and everybody can create in this language, and it is the biblical Hebrew. So he took back the language into the layers that for years people haven't dreamt or didn't dream of creating it. After him, you know that at least 400 years, consistent 400 years, people followed his legacy. Started writing in biblical Hebrew, poetry, in a very nice way, even created new words in what seemed to be legitimate in biblical Hebrew, and that was the whole golden age of Spanish Jewry. You cannot think of the Spanish poetry without knowing that the breakthrough is of Saadia Gaon. Another part of his conscious creativity that had to do with updating all Jewish contents to the times that he lived in. Not only that, he was the first one to create the canonized transliteration of Arabic into Hebrew. Until nowadays we use it. Because whenever you do not have the typeset of Arabic, you can use it because Saadia already gave the instructions how to transfer het to whatever, how to transfer dad to whatever, how to dal, and etc., etc., etc. So the set of canonized letters opened a new era in Jewish creativity, was made by Saadia in what he wrote, the method he wrote, and what he wrote about. It wasn't only that. Let's take a few more moments to deal with Saadia. With the daring writer, who was the one who opened the Jewish bookshelf to modernity, the one who makes it relevant, as you mentioned, to the time and make it relevant to the people who live around. At that time, there was already Jewish poetry. Byzantine period, you can go back to the biblical poetry. The first one to write Hebrew poetry in Arabic meter was Saadia Gaon. Later on, there will be a debate between his pupil, Menachem Ben-Sasson, the one who wrote Dore, and Menachem Ben-Sasson in the court of Chizdai ibn Shaprut. But when he wrote what he wrote, when Saadia wrote what he wrote, he was the only one who said in a very clear way, we should write poems in the way Arabs write poems, in the meter, in the way you use syllabi, and the way you expect it to be nice, aesthetic in the eyes of our time. Was it only that? No. He was also the first to write secular poetry. Until then, poetry was part of worshipping. You want to worship. Well, from time to time you create your own piece of prayer, you are the Chazan, you create it in a rhyme way. You know, Hakalian is recited until nowadays in Ashkenazi communities. The whole Machzor is based in Ashkenazi communities in what was written in Eretz Israel in the 7th century. No, Saadia Gaon created a replacing set. Not only to the prayers, because he wrote the prayer book, but also he introduced Jewish people to options that poetry at that time was ripe enough to share with the Arabs. He wasn't the first Jewish poet, not the first Jewish philosopher, who was the second. But his influence went from his time on. You do not have Maimonides, even though Maimonides thinks in a different way, if you didn't have the breakthrough of Saadia to open the new field of writing secular poetry, philosophy, or critical philosophy, and then we can go to the other layer, and to end with Saadia for this section. He was the one who rewrote the Talmud in a different way. What is the method of the Talmud? Many of us know. Associative. You talk about Mr. A, so you remember that Mr. A wrote another 4 issues and you mention it. It's very relevant to memorizing by heart contents. Indians until nowadays do it. It's nice because it gives you the spirit of the discussion in the academy, in the yeshiva. Is it the best way to memorize things by heart? Maybe. Saadia realized that the time of memorizing things passed. And the method relevant to bring together things in a reasonable way in his time was to put it in a rational way, namely systematically. You have to rebuild the Talmud. And if the Talmud is the book of law, so let's now cut and paste. Not only cut and paste, but rebuild it on an outline. So the first book that he wrote on law was in 926, was the book of deeds and decrees, and he says that's the first law book that I write in my big program to rewrite the Jewish law. So Maimonides wasn't the first who had the idea to rewrite the whole Jewish law. I'm going to write it in a different language, Arabic, in different terms that have to do with what you know nowadays. So he took the relevant terms from the Arabic bookshelf or set of laws, and he adapted it to his rewriting the Jewish law according to rational methods. So the first is book of deeds and decrees, and if you want to find something, it's like in a computer. He gives an introduction, and you know exactly what comes first, what comes next, what comes third. He gives not only an outline, but an introduction saying what is going to be in this book, rationalizing why such a book should be written in this way. It wasn't only this book. There were one after the other monographies that Saadia wrote, dedicating it to give a relevant tool. I go back, a relevant tool, written in the language of the time, in the method of the time, and using terms that are out of the Jewish tradition. Will you say that he broke? I mean, you may say it's not an orthodox way. I mean, you do not use the old terms. You may say you break the line of the Talmud. Maybe, but he did it consciously, deliberately, in order to supply with what people needed at that time. So you do not have any doubt that whenever you find in the Cairo Geniza lists of books, these books, for example, the book of deeds and decrees, is mentioned once and twice and some 30-something times. People mention it in their lists of books. And if you go to find copies of this book, because we've got different handwritings, you also find something around 20 different copy lists who made the business to copy this book in order to supply it with the courts or the public who needed such a book. Out of reading the map of his time, out of understanding the importance of the new language, the new terms and the relations between Jews and Muslims, Saadia didn't have a problem. It was natural to him because he lived in an environment that is described as the following in Baghdad at the 10th century. The description is by a very orthodox Muslim. His name is Said al-Andalusi, so you understand that he came from Spain. He said, you won't believe your ears. Aish. I was in Baghdad and I saw the following. Sitting a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim, a Majus, namely a Persian, and they discuss with each other theological issues in one condition. The only condition that they have is that you are not allowed to use a textbook as an authority, just logic. So that's the discourse. No books. I mean, for a Jew and for a Christian and for Majus, it wasn't a problem, but for one who has got the Word of God and the power to enforce it, it is an issue. And that is the condition. So Said says, it's maybe a break in the law, but that's the way they discuss it. And to our surprise, some 20 years ago, some of our friends found in the Cairo Geniza, David Clare, a reflection of such a circle from Cairo, end of the 10th century, people discussing Saadia's prayer book. So somebody supplied them with this prayer book in Arabic characters, and they discussed the essence of Saadia's book in Arabic between Jews, Copts. In Egypt, it was Copts, Jews, and Greek Orthodox Christians and Muslims. So that's the circle. I'm not trying to think in pink things that were in dark or in black. What I describe is what is brought from documents reflecting, and then what Saadia wrote, and he was the first. After him came tens or dozens of other books written by Jewish authorities, first in Iraq. Iraq was the first. Secondly, it was in Tunisia. They continued with this method, and there they wrote the first medical book in Judeo-Arabic, translated to Latin and later taught in Christian universities in Italy until the 16th century, of Yitzhak ben Shlomo al-Israeli, book on fever, was like a bestseller of that time, and then in Morocco, and later on in Spain. Even books analyzing the Hebrew language, and these were the first grammar books, dictionaries, but analytical books about the history of the Hebrew language and the structure of the Hebrew language, were written in Arabic, in Hebrew characters. So that's the lot. Was it the only facet? Was it the only facet of life of Jews and Muslims? No. The real change in the life of Jews was a reflection of the conquest of the Islam, and it took place from 629, in the life of Muhammad, and later Eilat and Makna, Ayla and Makna were the first to be conquered by the Muslims, and there were a few Jewish tribes up there, and then it was the Middle East within 100 years, all the Mediterranean, all the southern shores, and Spain into the gates of Paris were in the hands of Muslims. One system, one language, one legal status, new horizons were open. Legal status was different. Among the Christians, Jews were tolerated. Among the Muslims, they were protected. After a Jew paid, or Christian paid their poll tax, not that it was a marginal sum, but after the paying of the poll tax, namely giving the gesture towards the dominant religion in the area, nobody could touch a Jew or a Christian. That was a profound change, and they knew it. Jews knew it. It wasn't only a theoretical one. They were in the same status of the Christians who were the rulers until the day before the Muslims came. So all of a sudden, it's not only the status itself, the legal status itself, but the relativity of the status was changed. Reflection there was, in fact. Secondly, they opened the whole world. All of a sudden, Jews could hold weapons. They could cooperate with the conqueror, with the Muslim. They could go from the east to the west and from west to the east. They, dramatically changed their scale and the different economic activities. Jewish people who were beforehand mainly attached to agriculture, it's not all of a sudden, but within 150 years became involved in international commerce and in industry. Note that everybody left the land, but majority left the land. It wasn't paying. It's not like the Christian history that we study, Jews in Christendom, that they had to leave the soil, that they couldn't have their own land. They could have their own land in Muslim countries. They wanted to leave it. They wanted to use the new options. So they moved from Baghdad to Granada, to Fez in Morocco, to Cairo in Tunisia, and so forth, so on and so forth, because they want to make a new living. And you find descriptions of the Jews from the beginning of the 9th century as the world merchants. They move spices from India to Morocco, and they move gold and other textiles from Morocco and Tunisia to the other side of the world. And the advantage of them, says the Muslim, is that they know languages, not only Arabic, but also some of them know Greek, some of them know Persian, and they have the contacts all over the world. It's not a banking, do not be mistaken. it is the world commerce and it is the world industries that had to do mainly with textiles, but also other industry. So these are the new horizons opened, and Jews filled the new options with new contents, knowing that the situation is completely different vis-a-vis of those of Jews of Christianity. Knowing that their options are of new economy, new legal status, opening a new period in culture and language. It started taking place during the 7th century. It came to its power at the 10th and 11th centuries, and at that time you can hardly find a Jewish community that is not involved both in its regional issues and at the same time in the creativity that had to do either in economics or political life or, as I said before, cultural life of the communities. So do not be surprised that book on Indian mathematics is found written in the 10th century as a gesture of a Jew writing it to a Jew in Spain, expecting him to send him some money. Found in Turkey after around 900 years. Why? Because they were part and parcel of the region. Ha, you may say. But what's the meaning of political involvement? They would not be accepted to political life. Well, you will not find a Jew who is at the top of the pyramid of the country, namely a sultan, a caliph, or the like of it. But despite of Omar traditions or Omar Pact that says that no minority will have any ruling over a Muslim, the fact of the matter was that in many of the countries you find Jews as foreign ministers, as prime ministers, as those who ran the army. Shmuel HaNagid, street in Jerusalem, but at the same time he was the chief of staff. Chizda ibn Shaprut, whose name was mentioned before, he was the type of a prime minister. He started as a doctor and then ending up as a prime minister of Spain in 960s. How comes? They didn't do it as Jews. They do it as individuals. They were trusted because they were a minority at the beginning, but they ended up at the head, or almost at the head of the pyramid. So people would curse them. It would be an individual success. From time to time, the community will pay in blood for the success of the individual, either a Christian or a Jew. But the time, between the 9th century and the beginning of the 12th century, could be referred as a golden age, or at least time of convivencia between Jews and Muslims. And do not forget that there was one ruling system, Islam. That paying taxes wasn't an easy mission. That in order to implement independence from time to time, the Jewish community needed the power of the Muslims. But as a whole, you can hardly find a period like that. It was abnormal before the finding of the Cairo in Israel. Abnormal because to this part of the Jewish nation, which is in between 95 to 98% of the Jewish nation, which means that majority of the processes, and that's your father's terminology, took place actually in this melting pot. No, that's not his term, but the formative period for the Jewish people was that time, 9th to 11th century. Before that 10th century, there were few sets of Talmud, few sets of Jewish laws, few traditions that had two sets of law, two sets of Jewish traditions, even the versions, not profoundly different, of the Bible, of the Babylonian was not the same. The set of prayers wasn't the same, and you know the differences. It was around 60 differences between the people of Eretz Israel and the people of Babylonia. And all of a sudden, we are all an output of the Babylonian success, except for the Hebrew language and the tradition of the Bible. With that, Eretz Israel won. How come? Because Because whenever you are in a formative period, and 98% of the people share with the same experience, you should not be surprised that that option was grabbed by Jewish authorities, be it in the center or in the diaspora. It was an output of the Muslim period. It was an output of living together. It was an output of seeing what took place with the caliphate, or another caliphate, or a third sultanate. I do not have the time to go to the details. I just wanted to convince that such an option existed. Existed, I'm saying. It took place in a religious time. It took place whenever the set of values started with religion. I mean, priorities were set first and foremost by religious terms. Not that people didn't like to eat or didn't like to love or this and that, but that was the time. And in this set of values, people could live together. It wasn't all like that. I said 12th century because in the time of Maimonides will write to us, there was not such a harsh nation towards Jews like Muslims. Indeed, because he was enforced. I mean, Jewish communities were enforced to convert to Islam. Still, Maimonides is at the same time an admirer of Muslim culture and Muslim philosophy. And he would say, you should accept the truth from whoever said it. Either it is Plato or Socrates, or those who translated it or transformed it into the Arabic terms and culture. And he wrote in Arabic, and his language was beautiful. Why was it possible? And why was it possible for the Muslims to accept the Jews as part of their communities? And why wasn't the daily mission of a caliph or a sultan to try to bring the Jews to the truth? It wasn't only an output of an economic needs or political use that this Jew or another Jew gave you. It was an output, in my view, of flexibility of the coming terms that I think relevant even to later period, and if one would like to be more daring, also to what Dore said to the future. Look, whenever you deal with absolute truth, like any religion has, because you are the conduit to the Word of God. So you do not have any doubts that you have got the highway not only to perfection, as the son of Maimonides wrote a book, but highways to the ultimate truth, and there is no time that we are the only ones. It's only temporary that we are not ruling, would say the Christian, the Copt, the Majus, or the Jews. So if you use the absolute term of your religion, and you do not believe that there is an option for a federation of communities, then the crash or the clash will come. But if there is an option for the other, according to Muslim law, and they would say, yes, it's our mission maybe to bring the ultimate truth to the world. But at the moment there is enough of space, yes, in this federation for those who once had some religious quality, Jews and Christians. They follow the word of God. So Ahal al-Kitab, or Zimna, Ahal al-Kitab is a religious quality. They deserve to be protected, Zimmi, because, after paying the tax, because once they had the word of God, so we have to protect them. It's the word of God. A prophet came and gave them the word of God. It's irrelevant to nowadays, and that's the space. So you are capable of having them into your system without crushing or killing. You do not need to oppress. You just have to have gesture of subordination by paying the taxes, and it's worthwhile getting the taxes. So in the set of terms of ultimate God, there are options of giving the other leeway. just have to look for it. You may say for useful issues, for the benefit, for economic reason, choose whatever. I mean, you want to be cynical, fine. You want to be more legal, so you know that there is an option. You cannot kill everybody tomorrow morning, I mean, and have one nation, one unity. But in order to phrase it, you need a moment of generosity to include the other legally. Let's go to another way. The ultimate space. Yes, Jerusalem is religious to us, we say the Muslim, and the Jew, and the Christian. But do we have enough of space? So the Muslim came to Jerusalem and looked for a space. At that time, the shrine was an option because it was an option. It was ruined for years. It was a dust area for garbage area for the Christians. Therefore, they could build whatever they built. So what was the option of the Jews who came back to Jerusalem after the Muslim conquest? And they were invited over to come to Jerusalem. In spite of the unwill of the Christians, they took Mount of Olives, Scopus as we say nowadays, and they built there on, I can say, public presence, if they had to. And they had the nice public ceremonies announcing the words that Jerusalem is the center, and the political Jewish power that is in Jerusalem is mastering the Jewish world by ceremonies, by announcements, by excommunications, and it took place every Sukkot and every beginning of a month. There were ceremonies. If Muslims would not tolerate it, they would not let it. On the contrary, they gave special units in order to guard these ceremonies, making sure that the minority can process or have this ceremony. So yes, the space, we can say, you can be I would not let the other the space. But they learned that even though the space was very, very much relevant to the Jews and to the Muslims and to the Christians, there was some way. I'm not sure that I'm giving a solution, but I point to an option. And then comes the ultimate text. We have the ultimate text, the Quran. But we have the ultimate text, the Bible, or the other text relevant to religious life. Quran is not enough. You've got the oral tradition. If as a scholar, as a legal scholar, you would like to read the other into the text as I described before, then the text is flexible enough. And here comes the narrative Dore. Flexible enough because any legal text is given to option, at least that's what lawyers teach us. And at the end, there is the ultimate language. Well, yes, there is no question the Arabic language is the ultimate language. And yes, there is no question that the Hebrew language is the ultimate language. But then, you can find a way to put them together. The only question is, to what degree would you like to find some space or some leeway in space? To what degree would you like to find some leeway in between the ultimate language? To what degree would you like to find a leeway in the ultimate religion and text or instructions that you have? And the same with regard to economy and to the options that you have. So Jews were lucky enough to have Muslims as rulers until the 12th century. And I think that it is not by mistake, and excuse me if I'm controversial, the Jews of Islam, almost in any case, whenever given the option of martyrdom, didn't meet martyrdom. They would convert for the time being. You have several descriptions. One was in Morocco in 1148. Few met martyrdom and others converted. You have a very clear description what took place, how did it take place. First was the head of the community who was converted, and then the community as a whole. So the whole community remained as one unit. and the leaders could conduct the community as a crypto-Jewish community until the time is right to come back. So it was tough. I do not want to underestimate it. But maybe because the feeling was that it is not a fully worshipping of idols or paganism. And maybe because it was an output of the daily life, Jews next to Muslims. And because they didn't have ghettos. And maybe because they were flexible enough, I mean the leaders, to know that if you survive it, you continue later on with the original Jewish life. So series of testimonies go from the 12th century to the late 18th century in Persia, and the pattern is the same. What can we learn? Some of us are observant, so we know that when we finish our prayer, we go three steps back and we say, עושה שלום במרומיו. מי עושה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. Namely, in order to make some peace, you have to make some space or leeway. And it's not only for us, it's for others likewise. If we both learn it, I think that at least 6 steps are already between us, and then it's enough not to grab the other's throat because it's too far. Thank you.
Professor Ben-Sasson for his enlightening remarks, and I think this is a lecture that one should study after it's printed. But I think it opens up new levels of thought. One fantasy I had was to take you to your lecture. We have an Arabic website, and I was going to invest. I was going to invest in having it translated into Arabic. We'll talk about that later, because it's not only important for us to know that there was space between us and the Islamic world in the Middle Ages. It's important for the Islamic world to know that as well. Good night. Thank you.
What hobby did you have? Echt?